History lessons sometimes depict the Cold War as an all-or-nothing struggle. You'll see clearly delineated maps of who's communist, who's capitalist, and what the sides are. Now, I know many of you are fans of our sister channel, Kings and Generals, so this might hurt to hear, but let me tell you a secret. The reality on the ground about the Cold War is that it was always an ideological mess. Ideologies and alliances seem cut and dry, and the colors on a map can make things look simple and nice, but that's not how it was. For example, socialism, a political current much older than the Soviet Union, existed and even thrived in areas considered on most maps to be in the capitalist West. I'm your host David, and today we'll be talking about the state of Western European socialism in the early Cold War period. This is the Cold War. Many working class people in Europe, who in the 18th century might have sided with liberal revolutionaries in places such as France, were beginning to turn. The liberal ideas of freedom and liberty, espoused through movements like the American and French revolutions, were all well and good. However, factory workers and peasants couldn't eat freedom or shelter their families with liberty. Disenfranchised with what they saw as empty rhetoric from liberal movements, socialists advocated for tangible, edible political change. These movements bubbled up across Europe in the 19th century, one of the most notable being the legendary 1871 Paris Commune. But you know what? Since we're 200 words deep into a Cold War video and still talking about the 1870s, let's just say socialist ideas were becoming more popular in Europe. By the 20th century, socialism was an omnipresent force of resistance in countries across Europe and the world. When the First World War broke out, the reputation of many socialist movements was damaged. Many opposed what they saw as battle between colonial empires, with nothing to gain for anyone who wasn't rich and titled. They tried to stop participation in a rich man's war, which ran afoul of many wartime censorships and sedition laws. But the fate of the left in Europe and the world would change forever between 1917 and 1924, when Russian communist forces overthrew the emperor and his provisional government to establish the Soviet Union. You might have heard of it. Now, it might be hard to imagine from our modern vantage point, but there was a time in the 20th century where it looked like capitalism was on the way out. Despite the efforts of the White Russians and several capitalist world powers, the Bolsheviks were successful in founding the USSR. It sparked several other socialist and communist revolutions, or at least attempts anyway, in places such as Germany, Hungary, and Finland. But in the countries which would join the Western side of the Cold War, socialism wasn't the band of bearded revolutionaries it was in the East, or at least it wasn't just bearded revolutionaries. Plenty of beards to go around, but well worth noting that socialist movements had many more women participating in them than other political movements of the time. Anyway, despite an agreement in 1922 with the Fourth Congress of the International, or Comintern, calling for a united front with reformists, such as Social Democrats, these leftist tendencies found themselves eternally divided and fighting amongst themselves. You'll find this to be a common state for the political left in any period of history. The left in Western Europe divided primarily on methods and degrees of intensity. The three main currents you'll likely hear are communists, democratic socialists, and social democrats. A communist under this definition would be those bearded revolutionaries. These were militant and often had an on-again, off-again relationship with Moscow. A democratic socialist believes society needs a new political paradigm, but believes change can come through electoral victory and activism, and not necessarily at the end of a rifle. A social democrat believes in many of the ideas of socialist might. They like public ownership of services, such as healthcare and education, as well as strong unions and workers' rights, but don't necessarily want an ultimate end to capitalism. Communist parties formed in many European countries, often as factions within a more massive socialist party. Following the ideas of Marx, many communists believed a world revolution would end capitalism once and for all. According to Marx, it would occur in the most industrial developed nation on Earth. So many put hopes in a successful revolution in Germany. By the mid-20s, after Stalin had replaced Lenin in the wake of his death, the USSR took a position known as Socialism in One Country, which pivoted their focus and resources to strengthening within their own borders. The international revolution proposed by Leon Trotsky was more or less dead in the USSR, symbolized by his own exile and eventually gruesome murder. Many leftist revolutionary currents in the rest of Europe lost a bunch of their mojo. Socialism in Europe became primarily one of reforming what they already had, rather than starting fresh by shaking the Etch-a-Sketch. However, by the end of the 20s, the capitalist world was in a deep economic depression, one the Soviets notably didn't experience. This surge in leftist support still managed to create a backlash. Conservatives argued movements like Bolshevism needed to be killed in their cradle. In many European countries, an ultra-conservative, ultra-nationalist reactionary movement became popular. This would see the rise of fascism in places like Portugal, Spain, Italy, and most notoriously, Germany. There were, however, some notable exceptions. For example, in Sweden, a socialist government came to power, and with a Keynesian response to the Depression, had been somewhat successful. Successful enough, in fact, the rest of the West followed suit after World War II. In the UK, in 1924, the Labour Party formed its first minority government under Prime Minister Ramsay MacDonald. However, the Daily Mail, in a fit of dishonest journalism, led to this government falling to the Conservatives later that year. Hitler's government in the 1930s viciously attacked socialists and communists, decimating their political parties, and many of their members became victims of the Holocaust. In Spain, a fascist coup created a civil war in which a rising socialist movement also fell to a fascist dictator. Socialists who had been the most significant opponents of this rise in fascism began to decline. The capitalist world, uncomfortable with some aspects of fascism, but feeling much more threatened by socialism, decided to let all of this happen at arm's length. But eventually, fascism became too much of a problem, and the rest is, well, history. So the Second World War happened, and during the war, socialists and communists experienced a new level of appreciation. In places like Italy, leftist forces were a vital component in the fall of the fascist government there. In France, socialists were an integral part of the resistance to Nazi occupation. And in the Soviet Union, well, they conquered Germany. The first years after the war were an exciting time for left-wing movements on the continent. As the battle lines of the Cold War became more solid, many socialists and communists found themselves on the wrong side of the Iron Curtain. This led to many complex relationships. Many parties, like the Social Democratic Party of Germany in the nascent West Germany, began to move away from Marxist orthodoxy and distance themselves from Moscow. Many democratic socialists softened their stance on the end of capitalism to become social democrats and try to make radical reforms to their country. There was a lot of leftist unity, the rare unicorn of left-wing politics, I should add. However, when democratic socialist parties were crushed in Eastern Europe as Stalin installed authoritarian communist regimes, well, the tension between Europe and leftists around the world began their on-again, off-again status. The international body for socialists, known as the Comintern, had been dissolved by Stalin during the war. So many socialist parties put together a new organization, the Socialist International, which in 1951 in Frankfurt wrote a declaration denouncing both capitalism and Stalin's concept of communism. The left of Europe suffered mostly from internal division. With the massive presence of the USSR, discussions of tactics and scope could mean going into the embrace or distancing from Moscow. They debate to this day about issues of revolution versus reform, or whether to aid leftist movements abroad. The Soviets did give a lot of help to explicitly communist movements in Western Europe. However, for the most part, Italy accepted, the communists played second fiddle to democratic socialists and social democrats, whom they had disagreements with the Soviets. And it was likely not an entirely organic tension. Remember during the Marshall Plan video where we said this? The funds made it to the rest of Europe, who then used said money, as the US intended, to buy American goods for reconstruction. So their loan went out of America and then came right back. That's not even mentioning that one out of every $20 for the Marshall Plan went to the obscure European nation of, The Central Intelligence Agency. Well, this is what money was actually used for. The US invested a lot of money to impede the progress of socialists in Western Europe. They tried to keep democratic socialists and social democrats from making coalitions with communists. They also gave support to conservative and liberal candidates. In the capitalist Western European country with the strongest communist and socialist parties, Italy, the US reportedly dropped $10 million to counter the influence in the 1948 election. The British and Americans even reframed Italy as a victim of Nazi Germany to let former fascists return to public service, fearing a left-wing takeover of the country. In Spain and Portugal, the story was different. These countries would keep fascist governments for several more decades. In Spain, political movements were much more based on trade unions. They also leaned more anarchist, but I don't want to add yet another leftist current to this already busy video. Franco banned all non-government trade unions and forced the rest of the workers into a single trade union known as the Sindicato Vertical, which was loyal to the government. Socialist, communist, and pro-democracy parties were banned, with the communists going into hiding. The Portuguese Socialist Party had to operate in exile, while the Portuguese communists, like their Spanish cousins, worked illegally. In the rest of Europe, democratic socialists, social democrats, and even communists, working as parties and coalitions of parties, found themselves as players in capitalist governments. They were behind many institutions in Europe, such as free education and healthcare, many of which continue to be enjoyed to this day. They would have a seat at the table as many of these countries rebuilt themselves, and they had say over new constitutions. In the immediate post-war situation, Belgium, Czechoslovakia, France, Italy, Norway, Sweden, and the UK, amongst others, had to some degree powerful socialist governments. There wasn't a time when being a socialist in a capitalist country was not an uphill battle. It continues to this day, but when looking at this clean map again, it's essential to know that they do exist and are responsible for some of the defining legislative victories in the countries where they operate. The story of the Cold War has a lot of muddy parts. We haven't even talked about Yugoslavia and the idea of market socialism yet. There was a major communist party in the capitalist country of Italy, and all along the way, the different worlds were looking to each other and trying to steal each other's ideas, rebranding them as their own. It, like most of history, denies a simple binary, and we'll try to keep that idea secure as we continue this series, so please make sure that you're subscribed to our channel and have pressed the bell button. We can be reached via email at thecoldwarchannel@gmail.com or on Facebook at www.facebook.com/thecoldwartv. We rely on our patrons to create these videos, so consider supporting us via www.patreon.com/thecoldwar. This is The Cold War Channel, and we will catch you on the next one.